Biology. Adrenocorticotropic hormone (ACTH), a hormone produced by anterior pituitary that stimulates the adrenal cortex to release several hormones including cortisol. Aldosterone, a hormone secreted by the adrenal glands that controls the reabsorption of sodium in the renal tubule of the nephron. Alleles, alternate forms of a gene. Alveoli, thin-walled, implantable sacs in the lungs where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. Aneuploidy, variation in chromosome number involving one or a small number of chromosomes commonly involve the gain or loss of a single chromosome. Anticodon, a sequence of three nucleotides on the transfer RNA molecule that recognizes and pairs with a specific codon on a messenger RNA molecule helps control the sequence of amino acids on a growing polypeptide chain. Assortment, a way in which meiosis produces new combinations of genetic information. Paternal and maternal chromosomes line up randomly during synapsis, so each daughter cell is likely to receive an assortment of maternal and paternal chromosomes rather than a complete set from either. Autosomes, the chromosomes other than the sex chromosomes, each member of the autosome pair and diploid organism is of similar length and the genes it carries. Barriers to gene flow. Factors such as geographic, mechanical, and behavioral isolating mechanisms that restrict gene flow between populations, leading to populations with differing allele frequencies. Biochemical cycle. The flow of an element through the living tissue and physical environment of an, for example, the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus cycle. Biomass, the total weight of living tissue in a community. Biome, a large scale grouping that includes many communities of a similar nature. Blastoceles, the fluid-filled cavity at the center of a blastula. Blastocyst, the developmental stage of the fertilized ovum by the time it is ready to implant, formed from the morula and consists of an inner cell mass, an internal cavity, and an outer layer of cell, the trophoblast. Blastula, a ball of cells surrounding a fluid-filled cavity, the blastocele, that is produced by the repeated cleavage of a zygote. Bronchitis, a respiratory disorder characterized by excess mucus production and swelling of the bronchioles caused by long-term exposure to irritants such as cigarette smoke and air pollutants. Calcitonin, a hormone produced by the thyroid that plays a role in regulating calcium level. Carnivores, term applied to a heterotroph, usually an animal that eats other animals. Carnivores function as secondary, tertiary, top consumers in food chains and food webs. Catastrophism was popular belief that events in Earth history had occurred in the past, a sudden events, and by processes unlike those operating today, periods of catastrophic change were followed by long periods of little change. A subgroup, the diluvialists, contended that Noah's flood was the last of many floods which had occurred throughout Earth history. Chemotrophs, organisms, usually bacteria that derive energy from inorganic reactions, also known as chemosynthetic. Chromosomes, structure in the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell that consists of DNA molecule that contain the genes. Chromosome theory of inheritance hold that chromosomes are the cellular components that physically contain genes proposed in 1903 by Walter Sutton and Theodore Bury. Clavicle, the collarbone. Cleavage furrow, a construction of the cell membrane at the equator of the cell that marks the beginning of the cytokinesis in animal cells. The cell divides as the furrow deepens. Climax community, the stage in community succession where the community has become relatively stable through successful adjustment to its environment. Clone, an exact copy of a DNA segment produced by recombinant DNA technology. Closed community, a community in which populations have similar range boundaries and density fixed, forms a discrete unit with the sharp boundaries. Codominance, a type of inheritance in which heterozygotes fully express both alleles. Codon, a sequence of three nucleotides in messenger RNA that codes for a single amino acid. Community edge, one of the factors that helps cause the latitudinal diversity gradient. Tropical communities have had more time to evolve because they have been less disrupted by advancing ice sheets and other relatively recent climatic changes. Consumers, the higher levels in a food pyramid consist of primary consumers, which feed on the producers, and secondary consumers, which feed on the primary consumers. Continuous variation occurs when the phenotypes of trait controlled by a single gene cannot be stored into two distinct phenotypic classes, but rather fall into a series of overlapping classes. Convergent evolution, the development of similar structures in distantly related organisms as a result of adapting to similar environments and as strategies of life. Example, wings of birds and insects, the body shape of dolphins, sharks, and extinct marine reptiles known as ichthyosaurs. Deletion, the loss of chromosome segment without altering the number of chromosomes. Dendrites, short, highly branched fibers that carry signals toward the cell body of a neuron. Deoxyribose, 5 carbon sugar found in nucleotides of DNA. Diabetes mellitus type 1 and type 2, a disorder associated with defects in insulin action. Type 1 diabetes is characterized by inadequate insulin secretion. Type 2 diabetes as characterized by M-fed insulin secretion in response to elevated blood glucose levels or by loss of sensitivity to insulin by target cells. Diencephalon, part of the forebrain, consists of the thalamus and hypothalamus. Divergent evolution, the divergence of a single interbreeding population or species into two or more descendant species. DNA hybridization, the formation of hybrid DNA molecules that contain a strand of DNA from two different species. The number of complementary sequences in common in the two strands is an indication of the degree of relatedness of the species. DNA ligase and recombinant DNA technology, an enzyme that seals together two DNA fragments from different sources to form a recombinant DNA molecule. DNA polymerase and DNA replication, the enzyme that links the complementary nucleotides together to form the newly synthesized strand. Dominance, the property of one of a pair of alleles that suppresses the expression of the other member of the pair in heterozygotes. Dominance hierarchy, a social structure among a group of animals in which one is dominant and the others have subordinate non-breeding positions. Ecological niche, the role an organism occupies and the function it performs in an ecosystem closely associated with feeding. Ecological time, a time scale that focuses on community events that occur on the order of tens to hundreds of years. Emphysema, lung disease characterized by shortness of breath, often associated with smoking. Endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. Endothermy, the internal control of body temperature, the ability to generate and maintain internal body heat. Epinephrine, a hormone produced by the adrenal medulla and secreted under stress, contributes to fight or flight response. Epistasis, the masking of the effects of one gene by the action of another. Example, Windows speak masked by the baldness gene. Excretion, the process of removing the waste product of cellular metabolism from the body. Exon, a DNA bases that code for an amino acid sequence. Exons are separated by introns that code for no amino acid sequences. Extinction, the elimination of all individuals in a group, both by natural dinosaurs, trilobites, and human-induced dodo passenger pigeon. Fibroblast, a term applied to a cell of connective tissue that is separated from similar cells by some degree of matrix material. Fibroblasts secrete elastin and collagen protein fibers. Follicle ovary, structure in the ovary consisting of a developing egg surrounded by a layer of follicle cells. Founder effect, the difference in gene pool between an original population and a new population founded by one or a few individuals randomly separated from the original population, as when an alien population is founded by one or a few individuals, often accentuates Gap junctions. Junctions between the plasma membrane of animal cells that allow communication between the cytoplasm of adjacent cells. Gene pool, the sum of all the genetic information carried by members of a population. Note, there is no diving in the deep end of the gene pool. Gene therapy, the insertion of a normal or genetically altered gene into cells through the use of recombinant DNA technology, usually done to replace defective genes as part of the treatment of genetic disorder. Genetic divergence. The separation of a population's gene pool from the gene pool of other populations due to mutation, genetic drift, and selection. Continued divergence can lead to speciation. Genetic drift. Random changes in the frequency of alleles from generation to generation, especially in small populations, can lead to the elimination of a particular allele by chance alone. Genetic maps, diagrams showing the order of and distance between genes constructed using crossover information. Glial cells, non-conducting cells that serve as support cells in the nervous system and help to protect neurons. Gonorrhea, a sexually transmitted disease that is caused by a bacterium that inflames and damages epithelial cells of the reproductive system. Homozygous. Homozygous, having a one or more genes that have no allele counterparts, usually applied to genes on the male X chromosome in humans. Homologs, a pair of chromosomes in which one member of the pair is obtained from the organism's maternal parent and the other from the paternal parent, found in diploid cells, also commonly referred to as homologous chromosomes. Hypothalamus. A region in the brain beneath the thalamus consists of many aggregations of nerve cells and controls a variety of autonomic functions aimed at maintaining homeostasis. Immovable joints. A joint in which the bones interlock and are held together by or bony process that prevent the joint from moving. The bones of the cranium. Implantation, the process in which the blastocyst embeds in the endometrium. Incomplete dominance, a type of inheritance in which the heterozygote has phenotype intermediate to those of the homozygous parents. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck's view that features acquired during an organism's lifetime would be passed on to succeeding generations, leading to inheritable changes in species over time. Initiation. The first step in translation occurs when a messenger RNA molecule, a ribosomal subunit, and a transfer RNA molecule carrying the first amino acid bind together to form a complex begins at the start codon on messenger RNA. Initiation codon. Three base sequence on the messenger RNA that codes for the amino acid methionine, the start command for protein synthesis. Insertion, the type of mutation in which a new DNA base is inserted into an existing sequence of DNA bases. This shifts the reference frame in protein synthesis, resulting sometimes in altered amino acid sequences. Intron. In eukaryotes, bases of a gene transcribed but later excised from the messenger RNA prior to exporting from the nucleus and subsequent translation of the message into a polypeptide. Karyotype. The chromosomal characteristics of a cell also representation of the chromosomes aligned in pairs. Klinefelter syndrome in humans, a genetically determined or determined condition in which the individual has two X and one Y chromosome. Affected individuals are male and typically tall and infertile. Long-run cells. Epidermal cells that participate in the inflammatory response by engulfing microorganisms and releasing chemicals that mobilize immune system cells. Larynx, a hollow structure at the beginning of the trachea. The vocal cords extend across the opening of the larynx. L-DOPA, a chemical related to dopamine that is used in the treatment of Parkinson's disease. Ligaments, dense parallel bundles of connective tissue that strengthen joints and hold the bones in place. Linkage, the condition in which the inheritance of specific chromosome is coupled with that of a given gene. The genes stay together during meiosis and end up in the same gamete. Meissner's corpuscles, sensory receptors concentrated in the epidermis of the fingers and lips that make these areas very sensitive to touch. Messenger RNA, blueprint for protein synthesis that is transcribed from one strand of the DNA gene and which is translated the ribosome into polypeptide sequence. Methionine, the amino acid coded for by the initiation codon. All polypeptides begin with methionine, although post-translational reactions may remove it. Morula, the solid ball stage of the pre-implantation embryo. Mutation, any heritable change in the nucleotide sequence of DNA can involve substitutions, insertions, or deletions of one or more nucleotides. Mutation rate, the average occurrence of mutation in a species for a given unit of time. Myofibrils, striated contractile microfilaments in skeletal muscle cells. Myosin, thick protein filaments in the center section of sarcomeres. Negative feedback. The stopping of the synthesis of an enzyme by the accumulation of the products of the enzyme mediated reaction. Negative feedback control occurs when information produced by the feedback reverses the direction of the response, regulates the secretion of most hormones. Net primary productivity, the rate at which producers, usually plants, biomass is created in a community. Net, the biological rule flagged by a species. Node of Renwier, a gap between two of the Schwann cells that make up an axon myelin sheath serves as a point for generating a narrow impulse. Non-disjunction, the failure of chromosomes to separate properly during cell division, the unequal segregation of chromosomes during meiosis. This forms cell with either too many, possibly one or more single or set of chromosomes, too many or too few chromosomes. That to be a common cause for Down syndrome, where Sufferers often have an extra copy of chromosome number 21, nucleotide sequences. The genetic code encrypted in the sequence of bases along a nucleic acid. Oncogenes, genes that can activate cell division and cells that normally do not divide or do so only slowly. A gene that, when overexpressed, lead to cancer, but which normally functions in cell division. Oocyte, a cell that well as undergoing development into a female gamete. Osmoconformers, marine organisms that have no system of osmoregulation and must change the composition of their body fluid as the composition of the water changes, include invertebrates such as jellyfish, scallops, and crabs. Osmoregulation, the regulation of the movement of water by osmosis into and out of cells, the maintenance of water balance within the body. Osmoregulators, marine vertebrates whose body fluids have about one-third the solute concentration of seawater must therefore undergo osmoregulation. Osteoblasts, bone-forming cells. Osteoclasts, cells that remove material to form the central cavity and along bone. Osteocytes, bone cells that lay down new bone found in concentric layers of compact bone. Bone cells, a type of connective tissue. Osteoporosis, a disorder in which the mineral portion of bone is lost, making the bone weak and brittle, occurs most commonly in post-menopausal women. Oviduct, tubes that connect the ovaries and the uterus, transport sperm to the ova, transport the fertilized ova to the uterus, and serve as the site of fertilization, also called the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. Ovulation, the release of the oocyte onto the surface of the ovary, occurs at the midpoint of the ovarian cycle. The release of the ovum from the ovary after the peaking of luteinizing hormone concentration in the blood during the menstrual cycle. Ovum, the female gamete egg, oxytocin, a peptide hormone secreted by the posterior pituitary that stimulates the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. Ozone, a triatomic O3 form of oxygen that is formed in the stratosphere when sunlight strikes oxygen atoms. That atmospheric ozone helps filter radiation from the sun. Pacinian corpuscles, sensory receptors located deep in the epidermis that detect pressure and vibration. Paleontology, the study of ancient life by collection and analysis of fossils. Pancreatic islets, clusters of endocrine cells in the pancreas that secrete insulin and glucagon, also known as islets of Langerhans. Parasympathetic system, the subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that reverses the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, part of the autonomic nervous system that controls heartbeat, respiration, and other vital functions. Pectoral girdle. In humans, the bony arc by which the arms are attached to the rest of the skeleton, composed of the clavicle and scapula. Pedigree analysis, a type of genetic analysis in which a trait is traced through several generations of a family to determine how the trait is inherited. The information is displayed on a pedigree chart using standard symbols. Pelvis. The hollow cavity formed by two hip bones. Peripheral nervous system. The division of the nervous system that connects the central nervous system to other parts of the body. Components of the nervous system that transmit messages to the central nervous system. Pineal gland, a small gland located between the cerebral hemispheres of the brain that secretes melatonin. Pioneer community, the initial community of colonizing species. Placenta, an organ produced from interlocking maternal and embryonic tissue, and placental mammal supplies nutrients to the embryo and fetus and removes wastes. Plasmids, self-replicating circular DNA molecules found in bacterial cells, often used as vectors in recombinant DNA technology. Small circles of double-stranded DNA found in some bacteria. Plasmids can carry from 4 to 20 genes. Plasmids are a commonly used vector in recombinant DNA studies. Pleiotropic, a term describing a genotype with multiple phenotypic effects. For example, sickle cell anemia produces a multitude of consequences, and those artifacts such as heart disease, kidney problems, etc. Polygenic inheritance occurs when a trait is controlled by several gene pairs, usually result in continuous variation. Polymerase chain reaction, a method of amplifying or copying DNA fragments that is faster than cloning. The fragments are combined with DNA polymerase nucleotides and other components to form a mixture in which the DNA is cyclically amplified. Polynucleotides, long chains of nucleotides formed by chemical links between the sugar and phosphate groups. Pons, the region that, with the medulla oblongata, makes up the hindbrain, which controls heart rate, constriction and dilation of blood vessels, respiration, and digestion. Positive feedback control occurs when information produced by the feedback increases, accelerates the response. Principle of segregation. Mendel's first law holds that each pair of factors of heredity separate during gamete formation so that each gamete receives one member of a pair. Prion. Infectious agents composed of only one or more protein molecules without any accompanying genetic information. Purine. One of the group of nitrogenous bases that are part of nucleotide. Purines are adenine and guanine and are double ring structures. Pyrimidine, one of the group of nitrogenous bases that are part of nucleotide. Pyrimidines are single ringed and consist of the bases thymine and DNA uracil replacing thymine and RNA. Recombinant DNA molecules. New combination of DNA fragments formed by cutting DNA segments from two sources with restriction enzymes and then joining the fragments together with DNA ligase. Interspecies transfer of gene usually through a vector such as a virus or plasmid. Recombinant DNA technology, a series of techniques in which DNA fragments are linked to self-replicating forms of DNA to create recombinant DNA molecules. These molecules in turn are replicated in a host cell to create clones of the inserted segments. Recombination, a way in which meiosis produces new combinations of genetic information during synapses. Chromatids may exchange parts with other chromatids, leading to a physical exchange of chromosome parts. Thus, genes from both parents may be combined on the same chromosome, creating a new combination. Reflex, a response to a stimulus that occurs without conscious effort, one of the simplest forms of behavior. Reflex arc, pathway of neurons, effectors, and sensory receptors that participate in a reflex. Renin, an enzyme secreted by the kidneys that converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin II. Replication, process by which DNA is duplicated prior to cell division. Resting potential. Resting potential. The difference in electrical charge across the plasma membrane of a neuron. Distraction, fragment length, polymorphism, RFLP. A heritable difference in DNA fragment length and fragment number passed from generation to generation in codominant way. Rheumatoid arthritis, a crippling form of arthritis that begins with inflammation and thickening of the synovial membrane, followed by bone degeneration and DNA transcript. Term applied to RNA transcribed in the nucleus. Sarcomeres are sarcomeres. The functional units of skeletal muscle consist of filaments of myosin and actin. Saturated fat, a fat with single covalent bond between the carbon of its fatty acids. Schwann cells, specialized glial cells that form the myelin sheath that coats many axons. Cells surrounding the axons of some neurons, thus forming the myelin sheath. Secretin, a hormone produced in the duodenum that stimulates alkaline secretions by the pancreas and inhibits gastric emptying. Selective breeding. Selective breeding, the selection of individuals with desirable traits for use in breeding. Over many generations, the practice leads to the development of strains with the desired characteristics. Sex linkage, the condition in which the inheritance of a sex chromosome is coupled with that of a given gene. For example, red-green color blindness and hemophilia in humans. Traits located on the X chromosome. Skeletal muscles. Muscle that is generally attached to the skeleton and causes body parts to move. Consists of muscle fibers, voluntary muscle cells that have striated appearance. These muscles control skeletal movements and are normally under conscious control. Sliding filament model. Model of muscular contraction in which the actin filaments and the sarcomere slide past the myosin filaments, shortening the sarcomere and therefore the muscle. Smooth muscle. Muscle that lacks striation found around circulatory system, vessels, and in the walls of such organs as the stomach, intestines, and bladder, involuntary, not striated cells that control autonomic functions such as digestion and artery contraction. Social behavior. Behavior that takes place in a social context and results from the interaction between and among individuals. Sodium potassium pump. The mechanism that uses ATP energy to reset the sodium and potassium ions after transmission of a neural impulse. Somatic nervous system. The portion of the peripheral nervous system consisting of the motor neuron pathways that innervate skeletal muscles. Somatostatin, pancreatic hormone that controls the rate of nutrient absorption into the bloodstream. Start codon. The codon, AUG, methionine, on a messenger RNA molecule where protein synthesis begins. System cells. Cells and bone marrow that produce lymphocytes by mitotic division. Sternum, the breastbone. Steroids, compounds with a skeleton of four rings of carbon to which various side groups are attached. One of the three main classes of hormones, stickins term applied to DNA sequences cut with restriction enzymes, where the cuts will bond with each other or with another sequence cut with the same enzyme. Stop codon. The codon on messenger RNA molecule where protein synthesis stops. Synapse. The junction between an axon and an adjacent neuron. Synapses. The alignment of chromosomes during meiosis 1 so that each chromosome is beside its homologue. Synaptic cleft. The space between the end of a neuron and an adjacent cell synaptic vesicle at the synapse end of an axon that contain target cells. A cell that a particular hormone affects by its direct action, either passing through the membrane or binding to a surface receptor. Tarsals, the bones that make up the ankle joint. Taxes, the behavior when an animal turns and moves toward or away from an external stimulus. Template strand, the strand of DNA that is transcribed to make RNA. Temporal lobe, the lobe of the cerebral cortex that is responsible for processing auditory signals. Tendons, bundles of connective tissues that link muscle to bone. Fibrous connective tissues that connect muscle to bone. Termination, the end of translation occurs when the ribosome reaches the top codon on the messenger RNA molecule and the polypeptide, the messenger RNA, and the transfer RNA molecule are released from the ribosome. Termin- termination codon, one of three base sequences that initiate termination of the protein synthesis process. Testosterone, 6 hormone that stimulates sperm formation, promotes the development of the male duct system in the fetus. It is responsible for secondary sex characteristics such as facial hair growth. Tetrad, the four chromatids in each cluster during synapses formed by the two sister chromatids in each of the two homologous chromosomes. Transcription: the synthesis of RNA from a DNA template, the making of RNA from one strand of the DNA molecule. Transfer RNA: small single-stranded RNA molecule that bind to amino acids and deliver them to the proper codon or messenger RNA. The drugs of protein synthesis that carry the specified amino acid to the ribosome, abbreviated transfer RNA. Translation: the synthesis of protein on a template messenger RNA consists of three steps: initiation, elongation, and termination. Making a polypeptide sequence by translating the genetic code of a messenger RNA molecule associated with a ribosome. Translocation: the movement of a segment from one chromosome to another without altering the number of chromosomes. To the movement of fluid through the phloem from one part of plant to another with the direction of movement depending on the pressure gradient between source and sink regions. Tropic hormone: hormone made by one gland that causes another gland to secrete a hormone. Tropism: the movement of plant part toward or away from a stimulus in the plant environment. Plant movement in response to an environmental stimulus. True breeding occurs when self-fertilization gives rise to the same traits in all offspring, generation after generation, now interpreted as equivalent to homozygous. Umbilical cord: the structure that connects the placenta and the embryo, contains the umbilical arteries and the umbilical vein. Uracil: the pyrimidine that replaces thymine in RNA molecules and nucleotides. Ureter: a muscular tube that transports urine by peristaltic contractions from the kidneys to the bladder. Urethra: a narrow tube that transports urine from the bladder to the outside of the body. In males, it also conducts sperm and semen to the outside. Urine: fluid containing various wastes that is produced in the kidney and excreted from the bladder. Vasectomy: a contraceptive procedure in men in which the vast brain is cut and the cut ends are sealed to prevent the transportation of sperm. Surgical separation of the vast brain so that sperm, while still produced, do not leave the body. Vasopressin vectors: self-replicating DNA molecules that can be joined with DNA fragments to form recombinant DNA molecule. Vestigial structures: non-functional remains of organs that were functional in ancestral species and may still be functional in related species, for example, due class of dogs. X chromosome, one of six chromosomes. Z lines: dense areas and myofibrils that mark the beginning of the sarcomeres. The actin filaments of the sarcomeres are anchored in the Z lines. Useful websites for biology: biology.com, ukonline.co.uk, biology.about.com, ase.organization, biozone.com.uk, newbyte.com, abpi.organization.uk.